I think there are a number of causes for the increase in inflation that we're seeing. It ultimately comes down to supply and demand, and to some extent, because of the dislocations with COVID or the issues around the Ukraine, there has been a reasonably sharp decrease in the supply of goods. At the same time, I think because of global forces, there's been a sharp decrease in the supply of labor. Perhaps more appropriately, you haven't had the sharp increase in the supply of labor. Of the two, the labor is statistically the more important and the more enduring. Goods prices move up and down pretty regularly. Labor costs generally tends to move in one direction. And as I said, I think that is the more important and the more enduring. There was a very dramatic increase in the supply of labor starting in the 1990s, when the Berlin Wall came down, and the labor supply, particularly in Eastern Europe, contributed fairly dramatically to the global supply of labor. In the 2000s, the entry of China into the world markets increased the supply of relatively cheap labor, in that case via companies manufacturing in China. And that increase in supply in the 90s and early 2000s is really what kept inflation under control for the last 15 or 20 years. That dramatic increase is not going to be a feature of the supply of labor going forward. The increase in the Chinese labor market onto the world market substantially reduced the cost of labor, and therefore had a secular impact on the reduction in labor cost globally. During COVID, or the aftermath of COVID, when China shut down, obviously that decreased the supply. I think going forward in the short run, China's coming back onto the world market is going to increase demand for things like energy and precious metals, other metals. So that's going to have a positive impact on inflation, namely that inflation will go up. Also, to the extent that Chinese consumers come onto the market, that will increase global demand. And of course, that'll tend to drive up inflation. In the intermediate term, I think there will be the availability of Chinese labor, which will have a dampening effect. But I think in the short run, China coming back after their shutdown is going to have a near-term positive impact on inflation, namely that inflation would go up. The climate impact is per se going to be difficult to measure. Clearly, to the extent that climate change itself disrupts supply, either through meteorological impact, agricultural impact, and it diminishes the supply, that's obviously going to have the effect of increasing inflation. Attempts to deal with climate change, moving away from fossil fuels, again, in the short run, will have the impact of diminishing supply of certain sources of energy, and particularly electricity. So that would have a positive impact. I think in the long run, if we don't deal with it in some way, that could make those temporary impacts on inflation more permanent. We are not likely to have a major increase in supply of labor. The current environment is it's a very tight labor market, and therefore the cost of labor is likely to go up. Demographics, the need for governments to borrow, all of that also mitigates for higher interest rates. The other biggest takeaway is that because of the high inflation and because of the pressure on interest rates, in making business decisions, operating decisions, capital decisions, I think what ought to be in the minds of business people as a high possibility, if not a probability, is that the longer term risk-free rate, instead of being in the order of magnitude of 2 to 3%, is more likely to be 5 to 6%, which, although substantially higher than it has been in the last 15 years, is still well below the average of the last 50 years. I think the biggest takeaway from all of these trends is that the lower interest rates that have prevailed in the last 15 years are unlikely to be characteristic of the interest rate environment we're going to see, certainly over the intermediate term.